shit, where are they?
Comrade, I can see that I disgust you. My composure, I think, revolts you. My normality. Forgive me, I understand your distaste. I know I cannot expect your pity, but then I do not seek your pity. I see your pity turns instead on Major Reuben, and that too I understand. I would have it so. Yet lacking your pity, I must look to my defense, should you permit it. And since you judge rather than pity me, I see it, comrades, in your eyes, your impatience. For my part, I am content to be judged. I see my protection in your judgment, not your pity. May I enter, then, a plea of guilty? But of course, how could I not be guilty in such a case? I assure you I am guilty. Then why a defense? Comrades, excuse the irregularity. I propose to defend my guilt. If you allow it, I shall even bring a witness to my guilt, a silent witness. My irony offends you. I apologize, I withdraw, but I cannot now withdraw my witness. Forgive me, it is the thigh bone of Officer Lubianco. To be precise, the left thigh bone, sharpened, you will note, to a point on the stone floor of our cell, for the purpose of killing Officer Reuben, my brother Reuben, I confess it. For killing Comrade Officer Reuben at our eventual moment of trial, had it come to that, between him and me, Reuben and Bukov, the two last of our seven. At that moment, that final moment, could I have destroyed him, you will ask. I ask myself, could I have done it? And I know I cannot tell. How can I tell what I would have done? How can we ever tell? Please, I beg you disregard my last question. Strike it out. I discuss no generalities. The history is mine. For me alone the question, most certainly not for you. How could I presume to ask what you would have done? There are, however, certain facts I can offer for your consideration, and they are these, principally these, that I and 6 comrade officers captured in the enemy counteroffensive were entombed in a cell in the abandoned monastery of St. Peter Rabinovich on May the 23rd. A cell measuring 11 paces long by 9 paces wide and some 20 feet high. And that in this cell without food or water, my brothers and I remained for over 2 months until the enemy was pushed back yet again and we were released. That is, Officer Reuben and I, the last 2, the survivors. Comrades, surely you cannot miss the paradox here. The paradox we too present. Perhaps you would term it something else, something less neutral, but I prefer the paradox of Major Reuben's insanity, as you conceive it, and my composure. I am not as I should be, you feel? How can it be that I am so composed? I am not as Officer Reuben, whom you judge deranged, therefore I am twice an obscenity. Is it not so? Forgive me, comrades, I am what I am. Upon your paradox, all I would say is that at the last my brother Reuben's state of mind allowed me some advantage over him, and had we not been, as it were, disinterred, I should have had to decide upon employment of that advantage or otherwise. For by the 8th week, yes, the 8th week, I kept the days most carefully, comrades, by the sun, since we were stripped of our effects, stripped of everything, left naked when the enemy imprisoned us, stripped even of our uniforms. Cruel touch that, I think, take our uniforms in the circumstances. However, by the sun, entering and leaving our cell each day through a small barred window high on the outer wall, I kept time, kept strict time, and by the 8th week, when we were alone, he and I, the last 2, the survivors, Officer Reuben was much changed. His strength remained, oh, much greater strength than mine. He was a gymnast, let me tell you, in his respites from the war, but he sobbed so. He wept and moaned and screamed by turns. He babbled like a child and tore his hair. He clawed his skin. He clawed a hole in his side with his fingernails. another on his neck. Doubtless your doctors have noticed deep holes festering. Sometimes he would sleep quite unguardedly, and then I would leave my wall and go to him to nurse him, to cradle him, until he woke a little clearer, and would throw me back to my wall in fear, you understand, at his own unguardedness, only to begin his weeping again a moment later. I even fed him. Yes, I fed him. How do you think we were still alive, Officer Reuben and I, after 60 days? I fed him as I fed myself, on the flesh of our dead brothers. And your horror at that feeding, your shrinking from it, they do you no credit in this wide room as my judges. The emotion of horror I would grant only to Officer Scriabin. Presumably you have read his report. I shall spare you repetition. But to Scriabin alone would I concede horror, to the young lieutenant of infantry who broke open the door of our prison and in the beam of his torch saw me feeding my brother Reuben, saw me feeding him the flesh of another man, and saw the remains of our dead comrade. But you, my judges, you have seen nothing. You've only heard. It's only words you hear, words you recoil from. And if these words revolt you, the more because they are my words, because my words are composed and clear, the words of knowing, not of rumor and report. If these words disgust you, then you have judged me already in your hearts. And such judgment brings shame as much upon you as it does upon me. Before suffer that judgment, I would beg the pity you have shown my brother Reuben, for my brother Reuben, could he speak of it, would say you have heard little yet. And how can you judge without proper hearing? Surely you did not think to avoid a proper hearing. You wonder how a sane man can return whole, as it were, from such an experience. You examine Officer Reuben, washed clean now of all that filth and blood, his hair shorn, his beard, his bowels sealed, his wounds dressed, and you know that if he woke, he would be wild. He would cower against the wall more like an animal than a man. So you bind him down, comrades, in his closed white cubicle with thick straps at the arms and legs, and you keep him asleep. You keep him from his own mind, because you pity the terror you think it brings him. And if you held him there long enough, you might almost forget the tale he cannot tell. Except you know that there is such fear, such agony locked within that quiet sleep. And you wonder, sometimes, does he dream? And you think perhaps to put him out of his misery. But should you do that, should you presume to do that, what then would you do with me, who am not noticeably miserable? Examine me, comrades. Allowing the customary effects of such incarceration, a certain weakness of the chest and limbs, a tendency to stoop, a certain frailty of the bladder, I think I function normally enough in the circumstances. And why not? It is amazing, comrades, what the human system can absorb, what the human frame subsists upon. Considered objectively, that is to say dietetically, many men have fed far worse than I, and yet survived. And you couldn't believe one man's flesh would rot another's innards, that one man's blood would stop another's veins. That would be superstition, wouldn't it? My body argues so. How then precisely am I changed? Am I, so to speak, of any further use? How have I escaped when my brother Reuben has been so hurt? May it not be that I have escaped unfairly? Am I not correct? You suspect me of a certain criminality? Well, you must interrogate me. You must put my experience to the test of your laws, your codes, your judgment. Very well, comrades, I am prepared. I concede I must earn my return to customary society. But you judge my present fitness, it seems, only by judging my recent experience. Therefore, I maintain you must hear the facts of that experience. I almost said the truth of my experience. That's absurd. Rather, the facts. The truth of my facts is for you to assess, so I beg you, comrades, hear me. Listen with your stomachs, if you will. With your noses and your tongues, your teeth. If you must, even listen, yes, with your hearts. But at least, comrades, listen. Do me that service, please. To hear what I tell and remember it as you judge me. In turn, I can perhaps offer certain preliminary details, verifiable details, I think, to encourage your trust in my accuracy. Colonel Tretyakov, for instance, had a wife with one breast who fed her fourth child on that one breast solely without undue discomfort. Again, I shock you, comrades, but I wonder, in your own experience, what do men do when imprisoned together? Don't they talk at first? And at first, don't they talk of themselves and their families? So Officer Tretyakov spoke to me of his wife. Similarly, I spoke to him of my wife. The little toe on her right foot is missing, as it happens, and she has a scar on her throat, which she tries to hide by keeping her hair long. It's not unusual, I think. Officer Lysenko spoke of the death of his mother. You have the names, I assume. Officer Tretyakov, Officer Lysenko, Officer Lubyanko, Officer Banishevsky, Officer Block, Officer Rubin, and myself. Rubin. Rubin and Vukov. Andrei Vukov. 7 men, in rank from Colonel Tretyakov to Company Sergeant Banishevsky. Lev Alexandrovich Banishevsky, comrades. We grew up together. We were boys together in Ryazan. We joined the war together, fought through 4 offensives, 3 retreats together. And this friend, comrades, this childhood friend, this dearest of brothers, I gnawed his flesh. Yes, I tore at his body, I sucked his bones. Yes, comrades. In horror, it revolts me. It's so predictable. You savor it. Is this a judgment or an entertainment? Must I accommodate my experience to your feelings as well as to your rules, your scales, your measures of behavior? You have a chart, have you? A checklist against which you can range my testimony, ticking off my evidence against your categories to calculate the degree of my residual humanity. And tell me, comrades, in your categories, does the flesh of a friend taste worse, less wholesome than that of a mere acquaintance? Perhaps you will allow me to suggest certain new categories for your list. For example, I might detail in order of preference the choicest regions of the human anatomy. Oh yes, comrades. Do not doubt it. How could you possibly doubt it? One develops one's likes and dislikes in such a case as in any other. Will it be loin, do you think, or thigh? Kidneys or liver? Shall I tell you how long it takes 6 men to tear another man to pieces using only their teeth and fingernails? Shall I tell you why genitals tend to be left late in such a case and heads left quite alone? Does blood taste better warm or cold, comrade? Shall I tell you? Shall I report my own findings? I am a connoisseur of sorts in these matters. Shall I help you feel the slip of human entrails? Shall I discriminate for your information between the eating of human excrement and the eating of human flesh, explaining why the latter might be preferred at a certain stage of our entombment? Surely my findings will prove valuable. Surely you will welcome such rare data. Might you not even honor me for it? Am I not, in fact, a hero? The man who has come through, the survivor? Might I not deserve a decoration? Am I not, in fact, a walking testimony to the effectiveness of our basic survival training? Perhaps not. When my 6 brothers, 5 now dead and 1 asleep, all graduated by the same course as I. Were we victims, then, of some fate beyond the manual of basic training? Yes, comrades, victims. Should I play the victim for you? Should I fall down on my knees asking how have I offended God that he could have done this to me? Or should I enter an existential complaint saying, I did not ask to be shut without sustenance in a cell with 6 others for 60 days. Comrade, should I say, it wasn't my fault? Or should I stay silent? Is that it, comrade? Is that what you want? Is that what you demand of me? The courtesy of keeping quiet? Sparing you the enormity of what I have to tell? No, really, comrades. It cannot be. In fairness to myself, don't you already have the evidence of the young Lieutenant Scriabin? Let me remind you, comrades, I spoke to Scriabin, and having once spoken, silence for me was impossible. The silence was for my brother Reuben, or at least the lack of words, and now you seek to perfect his silence. But for me, the moment I gave sign of rationality, it became necessary to defend that rationality, and I remember it. The exact moments, the precise sequence of moments. It was night, the 60th night. Only faint moonlight through the high grill, and suddenly the sound of footsteps beyond the door. The sudden vaulting of my heart, comrades, the shock. My breath caught, my ears pricking like a dog's, not thinking to shout, to intervene, my body rigid in attention, and the shock mingling already with regret, dismay, even a fractional dismay that it was over, that the pattern had changed again, that a new pattern would be needed, and the dismay mingling with the shock, the hope, then swallowed by it all in an instant, swallowed by the joy and the exaltation of my life reopening vast without horizons. Briefly, as the bolts were drawn, the locks were smashed, and the door, the great iron door, cracked open at Scriabin's shoulder, his breath coming in gasps at the effort, as the hinges split with a noise like thunder after all that silence, and his cry of revulsion. I remember it. He must have turned aside for a second at the reek of us. Then his torchlight sweeping quickly round the cell. My brother Reuben cowering, panic-stricken in my arms and yelping, and the torchlight veering towards the noise and taking an age to reach us, an age, passing us, returning, fixing us, freezing my brother Reuben in my arms like a child in my arms, and I blinded. Even my eyes, sharper than a cat's in all that darkness, blinded by a torch. And the torchlight merciless, unwavering, and I sitting back in its beam up against the wall without shame, flooded with calm, a century of calm, expectant, shameless. And I knew instantly whoever he was, for I couldn't see him in the glare. I knew him as comrade, not enemy. And the young lieutenant said only, "Oh my God," which was as serviceable a phrase as any, I think, in the circumstances. And at the same moment I said, "At last, you must have struck north through the birch forest." Now, I remember it, the precise words. And I felt him stiffen. I felt him recoil. And I saw what he saw. As the beam held me, I saw what it told him. I saw us, Reuben and me. And then I watched the torchlight move from us. I watched it move and fix. And move and fix. And again, I saw the cell as I had never seen it through someone else's eyes. The high walls, the carpet of blood like moss, the remains, the row of heads. Oh, the row of heads. How reverently Reuben had placed them, those heads. Solemnly, their eyelids closed, their faces to the wall, as solemn, as private to us, as undisturbed as in a tomb, a brotherly tomb. But to the young lieutenant of infantry, it was unspeakably horrifying, and his torchlight moved back to us in the cool darkness, questioning. He tried to ask who we were. He meant, were we his? And I said, yes! Yes, I said, we're yours, we're yours. Captain Vukov, Major Reuben, we're yours, we're yours. And from those moments, comrades, perhaps you can appreciate, silence for me was no recourse. I was given my white tunic, my size 10 regulation issued slippers, and left alone, isolate, observed, needing little medicine and no psychiatry, and therefore I suspect invested with imaginary deformities, a hump, perhaps, or fangs. Am I not the logical savage? Compelled to justify my savagery because I can't explain it. Comrades, my explanation shall be my defense. I am content to state the facts as I saw them. Of course, it is possible you might trust my evidence the more. Should I savor it with contrition? Should I exhibit an intolerable weight of guilt? Comrades, even I could not trust such demonstrations. In any case, I feel no guilt, no terrible remorse. I feel neither pity nor self-pity. I feel the residue of many emotions that were once real, but I no longer feel their reality. And what do I feel? Comrades, my defense is what I feel. I feel alive. Forgive me. I cannot entirely explain what I feel. Standing here before you, I say certain regions of my mind seem numb, as if cauterized. My memory, however, is clear. I believe my faculties unimpaired. Therefore, I present my report to you, without embellishment and with what precision I can command, the report of our entombment. Captain Andrei Vukov, Tank Squadron, 3rd Assault Brigade, begging to report an episode of war, 23rd May to 22nd July, at the monastery of St. Peter Rabinovich, bordering Katowice, southern Poland. Brothers, at first there seemed nothing unusual in our imprisonment, except perhaps the nakedness, which I had mentioned. The nakedness was unnerving. We had no casualties. It had been a disaster, a rout. We simply waited quietly, demoralized, for 12 hours, I would guess. No one came near with questions or with food. Then suddenly, it must have been about dawn, the enemy moved out and left us. There was a great commotion, comrades, engines roaring, hatches closing, commands, tramping feet on the cobbles, then everything was silent. Eventually someone, it must have been the colonel, suggested we build a pyramid to try and reach the high grill. Now, Officer Rubin, may I say, once the gymnast proved the pivot of this exercise, ungainly as it was, and after several calamities, Officer Block, being smallest of the 7, was hoisted up to the bars, where he managed only the briefest observation across the courtyard before the pyramid collapsed, with much attendant bruising, not least to Officer Block himself, who was left hanging perilously from the window grill for a second or so before falling heavily into the pile of bodies beneath with a quite consummate death howl. All of which caused great merriment and a momentary relief of tension. We lay there, we were crumpled in a heap, gasping with laughter. And Officer Block, between gasps, said, "They've gone. They've all gone." And I remember distinctly. We began to laugh again. It was on reflex, perhaps. Then slowly the laughter drifted away. We couldn't understand it. Officer Block was quite specific. There was no sign of life outside. Up until then, no one had bothered about the door. An enormous iron door set deep in the wall. Now we all had the same thought. What about us? All at the same time. It was uncanny. The laughter drained away, and we were all looking at the door, wondering, I know it, what about us? Naturally, Colonel Tredyakov was the one to find out. I remember he was limping a little. His leg had been twisted in the fall. He walked across to the door, examined it, found it fast and solid, felt in the wall surround, then stood a moment with his back to us, his narrow white back, and then turned and said rather flatly, I thought, "It's locked." Just its long, with an odd smile at the corner of his mouth. At the beginning, we had sat or lain casually together in the center. Now, curiously, we all moved back against the walls, separate. We were waiting on the colonel, his assessment. There could be several explanations, he said. Finally, we must wait, that's all. Later, several days later, it was I who suggested we should keep definite track of time. It was about noon, on the 11th day, by my counting, that Officer Tretyakov proposed drawing lots. Personally, I could never believe that the enemy had simply left us. Right to the last, I felt sure that it was some sort of ghastly experiment. And I felt certain that we were under observation. Right to the last, I felt certain that they would come back to check the results. And I don't know whether it was better or worse that they didn't, that they never intended to, or did they? That they merely left us to ourselves. We drank our own urine, then our own sperm. We sucked our own blood. It was hopeless. Day by day, at different rates, we all passed through the various stages of crisis. Thirst, hunger, rage, pain, acceptance, delirium, despair. Not surprisingly, some retained more control than others. It's a question of constitution, comrades, as well as a question of will. What frailties there were among us, or rather what precise varieties of reaction, I could not possibly suggest without implying some judgment, some criterion for judgment of my brothers, and who, comrades, could presume to judge another in such a case without knowing him absolutely, his entire life, his experience, his medical history, his descent, which would be difficult at best, don't you agree? I can speak with justice simply of myself, insofar as I know myself. And for myself, I can speak of the most ungovernable panic, the most demeaning fears and fantasies, the most groveling weakness in those early days when our situation was unclear, before we attempted some strategy for endurance. Comrades, I was about to say some strategy for survival. It's rather for endurance. That is, before our decision to draw lots, with the hair from our own heads at our brother colonel's suggestion. Until then, do you grasp the subtle refinement of taking our uniform? Until then, Officer Tretyakov had been first, as it were, among equals in our mutual nightmare. Through him, the gradations of rank had proved some help, a structure, if you like, to contain our suffering. Repeatedly, he reminded us that the monastery had been lost, seized, and lost again in the space of a single day, only 2 summers before. Even if the enemy had abandoned us, he insisted that there was the certainty of a counteroffensive. Then we might be free. For as long as he could, in fact, the colonel insisted that our situation had not changed. But finally, this became impossible. The tensions, comrades, perhaps you can imagine. How we bayed like animals beneath the window grill. How we scratched and scraped our fingers raw upon the metal door. Finally, I say the tensions were unmanageable. Twice we fell to blows, certain of us. And in the second brawl, one of us was bitten, quite badly, on the calf and shoulder. It was degrading, comrade. It was an unfamiliar position. There had to be some decision of response, and it cannot be a decision by rank or authority. If you will excuse the play on words,